Ava was a kind-hearted nurse, barely scraping by. She worked long shifts, putting others before herself, even though her own bills were piling up. One afternoon, she noticed an elderly man in the hospital pharmacy, counting his last coins, his hands trembling. Without hesitation, she paid for his medicine. It was a quiet, selfless act that no one else saw, or so she thought. Just 20 minutes later, her manager called her in, his face cold, his words harsh. Her heart sank as she was fired on the spot, but before she could even collect her things, a figure appeared in the doorway. Someone powerful, someone who had witnessed her sacrifice. Hi everyone, welcome to Mystic Tales. Today, I'm excited to share a new story with you. Ava had been a nurse at the hospital for 3 years. She wasn't just good at her job, she genuinely cared for her patients. Every day, she went beyond her duties, sitting with patients a little longer, comforting family members who were waiting with worried faces. Her own life wasn't easy. With student loans, rent payments, and her mother's medical bills, money was always tight. She often skipped meals, telling herself she'd eat later when she got home, but sometimes, later never came. One afternoon, as she was heading to her lunch break, she noticed Mr. Thompson, a frequent patient, standing near the pharmacy counter. He was elderly, his hands thin and fragile, as he fumbled with the coins in his pocket. The pharmacist was watching him, her eyes filled with concern, as he counted the same coins over and over, hoping they would somehow be enough. But they weren't. Ava felt a pang in her chest. She knew she didn't have much herself, but she couldn't just walk away. She went up to him, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Thompson," she said softly, "let me help with that." He looked up, surprised and embarrassed. I don't want to be a burden, dear," he murmured, his voice shaking. But she insisted. She pulled out her wallet, paying the full amount for his medication. He thanked her quietly, his voice thick with gratitude, his eyes misty. For Ava, it was a small moment, one that wouldn't change her life, but might just make his a bit easier. 20 minutes later, as she was heading back to her shift, her manager called her into his office. She felt a jolt of worry. The manager wasn't one for small talk, and his face was stern, lips pressed into a thin line. "Ava," he began, without warmth, "I heard you used your own money to pay for a patient's medication." She nodded, unsure what to say. She had acted on impulse, thinking only of the man's well-being. "We can't have this kind of behavior here," he continued, his voice growing colder. "This is a business, not a charity, and it reflects poorly on the hospital if our staff are seen covering costs." Before she could even respond, he handed her a termination letter. She felt her stomach drop, her mind racing. How would she pay her rent? What would she tell her mother? As she stood in stunned silence, the office door opened. She turned, and her eyes widened. The hospital owner was there, a tall, sharply dressed man, watching her with an unreadable expression. Ava's heart pounded as the hospital owner stepped into the room. She had seen him from a distance before, always surrounded by executives or speaking to reporters. Now, here he was, looking directly at her, his gaze steady and thoughtful. She felt exposed, uncertain of what he had overheard or why he had chosen this moment to appear. The manager quickly straightened up, his tone shifting as he greeted the owner with forced politeness. "Mr. Stanton, we were just, addressing a situation with one of our nurses," he said, casting a glance at Ava, his eyes narrowing as if she were an inconvenience. Mr. Stanton's gaze remained on Ava. "I see," he replied quietly, his voice calm but laced with something unspoken. He looked at the termination letter still clutched in her trembling hands. And what situation would warrant such a reaction? The manager cleared his throat, sounding defensive. Ava, here... She used her personal funds to cover a patient's medication. While her intentions may have been good, it's not the hospital's policy to provide that level of personal involvement. Ava could feel the heat of embarrassment rising to her face. She opened her mouth to explain, but Mr. Stanton raised a hand, gently stopping her. His eyes softened, and in that moment, she saw a flicker of understanding, almost as if he recognized something familiar in her gesture. "What did you do, Ava?" he asked, his tone gentle, inviting her to speak. Ava took a shaky breath. She was still processing everything, but his question gave her a brief moment of clarity. Mr. Thompson has no one, no family, no friends. He can barely walk on his own. I couldn't just watch him suffer because he didn't have enough to pay, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Stanton nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. The manager seemed uncomfortable, shifting his weight and avoiding eye contact with either of them. After a long pause, Mr. Stanton spoke, his tone steady. Kindness, empathy, those are the things that make a true healer. Not every rule captures that. He looked back at the manager, who was now visibly uncomfortable. Sometimes, policy doesn't cover the real value of someone's actions. The room was silent, the tension thick, as the manager tried to find the right words. "Mr. Stanton," he stammered, "with all due respect, we have rules in place to... Rules are there to guide, not to strip away humanity," Mr. Stanton interrupted, his voice calm but resolute. "Ava, you did what you believed was right, even though it cost you." He paused, considering his words carefully. "I think that deserves respect, not punishment." Ava felt her throat tighten, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness in his words. She didn't know what this meant for her job, but for a brief moment, she felt a sense of validation, as though someone had seen her for who she really was. Mr. Stanton looked at the manager once more, his gaze steady. "I'll be reviewing the policies around here. And Ava's employment status." He glanced back at Ava, offering a small, reassuring nod. As Mr. Stanton left the office, Ava felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't sure what the future held, but something had shifted. And as she walked out of the office, still holding the letter, she had a feeling that her life was about to change. Ava walked out of the office, her mind racing. She clutched the termination letter, still uncertain of what Mr. Stanton's words meant. She wanted to believe his support would change her fate, but years of struggling had taught her not to hope for too much. She slipped the letter into her bag and made her way home, her footsteps heavy, her heart weighed down by the day's events. At home, Ava sat alone in the small apartment she shared with her mother. Her mother's health had declined over the past year, leaving her dependent on Ava's income for her care. Bills stacked on the table, medical appointments, and rent payments felt like a constant countdown, always lurking in the back of her mind. She couldn't imagine what she would do if she lost her job. That night, sleep came in fits and starts, each moment haunted by uncertainty. The next morning, she woke early, still unsure if she should even go back to the hospital. But then, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Mr. Stanton's office, requesting a meeting with her at noon. Her hands trembled as she read it, a mix of anxiety and cautious hope washing over her. She dressed quickly, nerves fluttering as she made her way back to the hospital. When she arrived, she was led to Mr. Stanton's private office, a space that felt worlds apart from the bustling halls of the hospital. The walls were lined with awards and photos, images of Mr. Stanton shaking hands with doctors and smiling with patients. It was clear he wasn't just an owner. He cared about the lives connected to his hospital. Mr. Stanton greeted her with a calm smile, gesturing for her to sit. "Ava," he began, his tone warm, "I wanted to speak to you personally. I understand you've had a difficult time, especially with your mother's health." Ava looked down, her cheeks flushed. She hadn't expected him to know about her personal life, and she wondered who might have told him. "Yes, it's been hard," she admitted softly. He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Your act of kindness yesterday showed me something rare. In a world focused on rules and profits, you put someone else's need above your own, even at a personal cost." Ava felt a lump in her throat. She had done it without expecting anything in return. But his words made her realize just how much that small gesture had meant, not only to Mr. Thompson, but, apparently, to Mr. Stanton as well. Mr. Stanton continued, "You see, Ava, I grew up in humble beginnings myself. I know what it's like to worry about making ends meet. That's why I believe in rewarding true compassion. It's the foundation of this hospital and, I'd like to think, of life itself." Ava held her breath, sensing there was more he hadn't yet said. He reached into his desk drawer, pulling out a neatly sealed envelope, and placed it in front of her. "Consider this a token of gratitude," he said quietly, "and an offer. I'd like you to take on a new role at this hospital, one where your empathy and dedication can shine without the limitations others might place on you." She blinked, barely able to process his words. "A new role?" she asked, her voice shaking. He nodded. "I want you to oversee our patient assistance program. Many patients struggle with medical costs, and someone with your heart and dedication is exactly who I need to lead it." Ava's eyes filled with tears. She had been expecting the worst, but here she was, offered not only another chance, but a role that could help people in ways she'd always dreamed of. She managed a small, grateful smile, her heart full. As she left his office, she clutched the envelope tightly, a sense of possibility dawning in her mind. She hadn't even looked inside yet. But she could feel that, for the first time in a long while, things were about to get better. As Ava walked out of Mr. Stanton's office, she finally looked down at the envelope in her hands. With a shaky breath, she opened it carefully, pulling out a neatly folded check. Her eyes widened as she took in the amount. It was far more than she'd ever earned in a single paycheck, enough to cover her overdue bills, her mother's medication, and even set a bit aside for emergencies. She felt a rush of gratitude, her heart swelling with relief she hadn't felt in years. Returning to the hospital's main floor, she couldn't stop thinking about her new position, overseeing the patient assistance program. It felt surreal. A day ago, she was on the verge of losing her job, uncertain about her future. And now, here she was, entrusted with a role that let her help those who struggled just like she had. Ava took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her new responsibility, but also a renewed sense of purpose. The days that followed were a whirlwind of learning and adjusting. She found herself busy reaching out to patients in need, connecting them with resources and support. She met families who reminded her of Mr. Thompson, those who had been scraping by, counting each coin, feeling the strain of every medical bill. Ava knew their struggles well, and it drove her to work harder, to make a difference in every small way she could. One afternoon, she was surprised to see Mr. Thompson again. He was back at the hospital for a routine checkup. When he saw Ava, his face lit up with recognition and gratitude. "Ava, dear," he greeted, his voice filled with warmth. "I didn't know you were still here. I thought, well, after what you did for me." She smiled, her heart warming at the sight of him. "I'm here, Mr. Thompson, and I'm doing something a little different now," she said, her voice light with pride. "I help patients who might need a hand with medical expenses, just like you did that day." Mr. Thompson's eyes misted over. "You're an angel, Ava. You didn't have to, but you did. And now, look at what you're doing for others." He took her hand gently, giving it a light squeeze. "The world needs more people like you." Ava felt her eyes sting, a lump forming in her throat. She had given him something small, but his gratitude reminded her why kindness, even in tiny amounts, could change lives. She had found a place where her empathy wasn't just tolerated, it was valued, needed. But just as she was starting to settle into her role, another surprise was waiting around the corner. A week later, she received a call from Mr. Stanton's assistant, asking her to meet him again in his office. Ava felt a familiar nervousness, but made her way up, unsure of what this meeting would bring. When she arrived, Mr. Stanton greeted her warmly. "Ava," he began, his tone serious yet encouraging, "you've already done an incredible job with the program. The feedback I've received has been beyond positive. You're connecting with patients in ways none of us expected. But there's something more I'd like to discuss." She looked at him, curious, a hint of hope growing. "Of course, Mr. Stanton. I'm here to help however I can." He nodded thoughtfully. "I want to expand this program beyond our hospital. You've shown me what's possible when compassion drives care. I believe you can lead this program on a larger scale, across our network of hospitals." Ava's breath caught. She hadn't expected anything like this. The opportunity felt monumental, almost overwhelming. But as she looked into Mr. Stanton's eyes, she saw his faith in her, his belief in what she could achieve. The weight of his words settled in her heart. This was more than a job. It was a chance to bring her life's purpose into focus, to extend the kindness she had once offered in small moments to a much larger community. She nodded, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'd be honored to take on this responsibility, Mr. Stanton. Thank you for believing in me." As Ava left his office, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude and purpose. This journey, which had begun with a small act of kindness, was transforming not only her life, but the lives of countless others. And as she stepped into this new chapter, she knew she would continue to carry forward the compassion that had led her here. In the months that followed, Ava took on her new role with a sense of purpose she had never felt before. She traveled to different hospitals within Mr. Stanton's network, training other nurses and staff on how to recognize patients in need and connect them with assistance. She spoke to groups of healthcare workers about her own experiences, reminding them of the power of compassion, even in the smallest acts. Her efforts didn't go unnoticed. Each hospital she visited began to see changes, not just in how patients were treated, but in the morale of the staff. Ava's story of helping Mr. Thompson had become a quiet legend passed along among nurses, doctors, and administrators alike. It was a reminder of why many of them had joined the profession in the first place. One evening, after a long day of training at a nearby clinic, Ava returned to her apartment. She unlocked the door and walked into the familiar warmth of her home. Her mother was waiting for her, a proud smile on her face. "You're doing so much good, Ava," her mother said, her voice filled with admiration. "It's almost as if this was meant to be, like every struggle you faced led you to this moment." Ava sat beside her mother, holding her hand. "It's strange, isn't it? All those times I worried about making ends meet, now I have a chance to help others who are going through the same thing." She paused, reflecting on the journey. It's like Mr. Stanton said, kindness is the foundation. I think it always comes back to you in some way." Her mother nodded, her eyes filled with tears. She squeezed Ava's hand, pride shining in her gaze. "I always knew you were meant to do something special, sweetheart. This is just the beginning." As the weeks went by, Ava saw the ripple effect of her work unfold. More patients received the care they needed, regardless of their financial situation. Nurses and staff felt empowered to offer support, knowing there was a system in place to back them. Ava's own life had transformed. Her financial worries eased, her purpose clear, and through it all, she remained the same compassionate nurse who had once given a little, only to receive a lifetime's worth in return. One day, as she was wrapping up her work at the hospital, she found an envelope waiting on her desk. Inside was a handwritten note from Mr. Stanton. It was simple, yet filled with gratitude. "Ava, thank you for reminding us all of the true spirit of healthcare. You've changed lives here, and I have no doubt you'll continue to do so." Ava felt a quiet pride as she tucked the note away. She had found something deeper than just a job. She had found a calling. The journey had been filled with challenges, sacrifices, and unexpected rewards, but as she walked through the hospital halls that day, she knew that everything, every struggle, every act of kindness had led her to this purpose. She had given, expecting nothing in return, and had gained more than she ever imagined. Loved this story? Tap that like button and subscribe to Mystic Tales for more. Let us know how this story made you feel with a single word.